Hello. Today we're going to be looking at U.S. History, Chapter 15, The Cold War Begins. Now, before we start the introduction to this chapter, I think it's important that we first define what is the Cold War. And the Cold War was a period of tense relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. It wasn't an actual war in that we weren't engaged in military combat against the Soviet Union, but there was a high sense of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union over a number of issues, particularly differing ideologies. And this ultimately led us into the second half of the 20th century, which was really dominated by this Cold War. There's a great deal of debate on the length of the Cold War. Most historians would say the Cold War started with the end of World War II in 1945. But some say it even really goes back prior to that. It goes back to the beginning of the Soviet Union, even back before the Soviet Union was officially a country, all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution, which brought the communists under Vladimir Lenin to power in the Soviet Union. And others would point directly to the end of World War II, as Americans had disagreements over the end of that war with the Soviets. And an exact ending point is also difficult to determine because while the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some of those tensions from the Cold War still kind of remain today. And recently we've had some tensions with Russia. And some of those still center around those basic Cold War issues, the distrust between the two countries. So some would argue that maybe the Cold War hasn't even ended. But generally speaking, you can roughly say the height of the Cold War really would be about a 45 to 46 year period from the end of World War II in 1945 up into the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So the first thing we're going to look at as we look at the Cold War beginning is the Iron Curtain falling on Europe. And so what you need to understand is at the end of World War II, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States deepened, leading to an era that was known as the Cold War. And our learning objectives for this section is to explain how the Cold War developed during the 1940s. So looking at the roots of the Cold War. The first were the philosophical differences. Philosophical differences between the Soviet Union and the United States did reach back into the 1920s. The Soviet Union, for example, embraced communism, as where the United States embraced a free enterprise economic system based on capitalism. And the Soviet Union featured a totalitarian dictatorship, as where we had a representative democracy. So these differing ideologies were really at the center of the tension between the two countries. Now then there were also some World War II conflicts as well that added to things. For example, we were allies during the war but not truly friends. The Soviets wanted the British and Americans to open a Western front in Europe sooner than we did. Because that would, of course, take pressure off of them on the Eastern Front fighting against Germany. And also, the U.S. atomic bomb plans worried the Soviet Union. Now looking at the post-war conflicts. The Soviet Union refused to let Eastern Europe hold free elections as was promised at the Yalta Conference. And the United States resisted Soviet expansion. So this brings us to what becomes known as the Iron Curtain. Stalin wanted to retain political and economic control over Eastern Europe. The Soviets managed to install communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. Stalin outlawed political parties or newspapers that opposed communists. The Soviets jailed or killed some political opponents, and the Soviets rigged elections to ensure the success of communists. Yugoslavia was the one Eastern European country that was not under the direct control of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Joseph Broz Tito, a communist, refused to take orders from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union relocated Germans living in Poland and other countries of Eastern Europe. Look, Western views of the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill attacked the Soviet Union for creating an Iron Curtain. And in fact, the term, the Iron Curtain, reflected Churchill's belief that communism had created a sharp division in Europe. And it was, of course, Winston Churchill that actually coined the term Iron Curtain. Harry S. Truman urged his Secretary of State to get tough with the Soviets. Now looking at Soviet views of the Iron Curtain. Stalin believed that the Iron Curtain was necessary to protect the Soviet Union from Western attacks. Keep in mind that France had invaded the Soviet Union under Napoleon, or well, not the Soviet Union, I should say, Russia, but of course Russia was the largest republic in the Soviet Union, where the capital is based, and at that point in time, Napoleon, his troops got all the way to the capital of Moscow. Then, of course, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So there was this fear that the Soviet Union could be attacked again on their eastern front. And so they liked the idea of creating Eastern European countries that would be under their control, that would be a nice buffer for them. Stalin used Churchill's words to persuade his people that the United States and Great Britain were their enemies. And he also used this as an excuse to rebuild the military. Now here we have a quote from Winston Churchill. Here we're going to be watching a clip of the speech in which Winston Churchill coined the phrase Iron Curtain.